Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines where my guest is Clary. He's going to talk to us about a movement called Convention of the States. There's two ways that you amend the United States Constitution. You can do it via Congress or you can do it via a Convention of the States. I'm happy to report that Louisiana has already selected to do so, join that organization in that process. So join us on the next Legal Lines with Clary. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. First of all, I want to thank you for considering our firm for help in handling your legal matter. We know what we're doing. We've been around for a long time. We have over 60 years combined legal experience as lawyers. I've been practicing over 30 years, Sean over 25, and I have paralegals and legal secretaries who've worked for me for over 27 years. We've handled about every kind of case you can handle, and we've been very good at it. The bottom line is, it is our goal to be your protector when necessary, advisor, negotiator, and to successfully conclude the litigation for you in a way that is very favorable. Knowledge is power, and the folks who know what they're doing empower you. They enable you to make the right kind of decisions that best serves you. And that's our number one goal, frankly. Our number one ministry is to serve you. Hello, welcome to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and I'm very pleased to have back on the show Clary. He's an attorney here in Baton Rouge, and he's also kind of the media volunteer communicator with the legislator for a group who is searching and pushing for folks to result in a Convention of the States amendment of the Constitution. Dale.
Good to see you again, Locke.
Pleasure to have you back. So I probably didn't say it real perfectly there, but people get scared when they hear about a Convention of the States.
Right.
And they don't know what it means, and everybody doesn't want to amend the Constitution if it's going to change it. So explain to folks what exactly is a Convention of the States and why is it even something we care about?
What we're doing is we are enforcing the Constitution by using the Constitution's own amendment process. It was built into the Constitution that if the federal government ever ran away with its power and did too much stuff that it wasn't supposed to be doing, the states had the mechanism to be able to call a convention to propose amendments to reel in a runaway federal government.
And I love the story you told me about how this happened.
Well, it was like 2 days before the original Constitution Convention was almost finished. It was September 15, 1787. Colonel George Mason from Virginia stood up and said, guys, we have forgotten that the states need to have some mechanism to reel in a runaway federal government. And they put into Article 5 of the Constitution the very procedure that we're using.
And let's recall that those guys back then had run away and fought a war to get away from authoritarian, very centralized government, in that case a king.
Right, and that's, so they had personal experience with it. I mean, that's the whole Declaration of Independence that lists all the things the king was doing and then a foreign government was doing to them. And that's why they knew. They had personal knowledge of why it was important for the states to have control over the federal government.
And when it's all said and done, the Constitution is controlling, it's setting forth who has power and who uses that power based on what authority. So explain to folks.
Well, the way it is written, the federal government only has a few defined limited powers.
And that's stated, limited powers
in the Constitution.
Enumerated in the Constitution.
Right. Article 1, Section 8 sets out the powers that they do have, and then the 10th Amendment, part of the Bill of Rights, says that's all the power you've got, federal government. And what's happened over particularly the last few decades, since the early 1900s, the federal government has incrementally just crept out with the boundaries of their government, of their powers. And they've gone way beyond what the Constitution actually says.
And the primary tool, at least in my view, on how that has occurred is the judiciary, the courts.
That's certainly one of them. I mean, Congress just says, well, whatever the Supreme Court says we can do, we'll do it. And the Supreme Court, unfortunately, has kept expanding congressional power so that suddenly state laws on marriage get nullified by the federal government. There is nothing in the powers of the federal government or in the Constitution that gives them that power.
Literally today we have, 9 justices on the Supreme Court.
Right.
And normally the decisions are split 5-4. So we have 5 people who are not elected,
correct,
who are appointed for a lifetime, telling 330 American citizens what they can and cannot do. and the definition of institutions and words.
Exactly, and that's the problem. And that's what we're trying to do, is to reel in all of those judicial decisions, reel in what the federal government is doing, and frankly, reel in what the executive is doing. Is whether your president is Donald Trump or Barack Obama or George Bush, all of them are exceeding the powers that are given to them in the Constitution.
Because the way the Constitution is structured is people have all the power. They gave the states some of their power, and then the states gave the federal government, along with the people, very limited powers.
Correct. What we forget these days is that the federal government was created by the states. It was created by the people. And that's why it was given only limited powers, again, because they had seen what a king had done. And today, we're not so much. People think, oh my gosh, the federal government's in charge of everything. And that's just not true.
And really, over the years, what has happened is the sole authority is the Supreme Court,
Right.
the United States Supreme Court.
Well, and the other horrible thing, and I think the one that draws us all together, regardless of whether we're Democrats, Republicans, Independents, or whatever, is the money that's being spent. They're spending so much, over $21 trillion in debt now.
And that doesn't count unfunded liabilities, which could be hundreds of trillions.
Exactly. And you and I are going to be long gone. Our children and our grandchildren are going to be paying for that. And that's really what's going to draw us all together, regardless of our political stripes.
All right, so in their amazing wisdom, our founders provided for two ways that the Constitution could be amended. Tell the folks how.
Well, first is the way it's been done for the 27 times that we already have amendments.
And say that again, 27 times the
Correct.
Constitution of America has been amended.
Correct. They typically have initiated in Congress. Congress says we want to propose this amendment, and we get it. They send it out to the states, and then the states ratify it. And so the states, about 38 states, do the ratification.
Two-thirds.
Well, it's 2/3. Yes, 38 states. That's right. To ratify an amendment. So when the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments were ratified, it was 38 states. Same thing for the 25th and 26th. The other procedure also uses the exact same ratification process by the states, but the procedure for proposing the amendments, instead of coming from Congress, comes from the states.
So it's in a lot of ways a recognition that Congress, you can do this, but us, the states, have as much, frankly, more power than you, and the states are more accountable.
You can pick up the phone and call your legislator, and you're going to get an email back, you're going to get a phone call, you're going to get some kind of response. And I know that because we do it. I know you've done it, I've done it. You can call your congressman or your senator, and that's not to say they're bad people. They just have so many people
They represent
to be responsible.
millions instead of thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands.
And there's a chance your representative, you might even know him personally. They might see him at the grocery store, you might see him at church, but it's not really going to happen with the congressmen and the U.S. senators. They can't be as responsive as the local people.
All right, and so we've explained kind of how how this problem developed, why it developed, and the two ways that you're allowed to amend the Constitution. What specifically are the issues that is being proposed by this Convention of State group be addressed?
The Convention of States is addressing three things. One is fiscal responsibility, some sort of, whether you call it a balanced budget amendment or some other sort of fiscal money restraints on what Congress and what the federal government can spend. Number two is term limits. We're going to discuss the possibility of term limits for not only members of Congress and the U.S. Senate, but other federal officials, which could include judges, or justices on the Supreme Court. I mean, that's for this convention to propose, or any other federal officials. And then three is just generally reducing the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. They've taken more power than they were ever supposed to have that was given to them in the Constitution. So those are the three areas.
So, and you pointed out the debt is astronomical,
Right.
and the bottom line is many states, I think Louisiana is required to have a balanced budget, but the federal government just keeps spending our money and, like we said, children, grandchildren's money, and there's no way to curb this apparently. They're not going to stop it, so the states have to stop it.
Exactly. What's funny is they have what's called mandatory spending in Washington, D.C., which kind of drives me crazy because Congress is supposed to be controlling all the spending, and they say, well, we can't touch it. It's mandatory. Well, it's not mandatory, Congress. You can shut off that valve anytime you want to. They just won't.
And so the bottom line is they have control of the purse strings, but they're not going to rein in their own power, which is basically the ability to spend.
And we've sent a lot of good people from not just Louisiana, but all the states have sent some good people to Washington, D.C. This is not an indictment of the individuals that go up there. It's just they can't do it or they won't do it.
All right, well, we'll continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines. We're talking about a convention of the states with Dale Clary. We'll be right back. Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. First of all, I want to thank you for considering our firm for help in handling your legal matter. We know what we're doing. We've been around for a long time. We have over 60 years combined legal experience as lawyers. I've been practicing over 30 years, Sean over 25, and I have paralegals and legal secretaries who've worked for me for over 27 years. We've handled about every kind of case you can handle, and we've been very good at it. The bottom line is, it is our goal to be your protector when necessary, advisor, negotiator, and to successfully conclude the litigation for you in a way that is very favorable. Knowledge is power, and the folks who know what they're doing empower you. They enable you to make the right kind of decisions that best serves you. And that's our number one goal, frankly. Our number one ministry is to serve you. Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. Again, pleased to have on the show Dale Clary, and we're talking about Convention of the States. What is it? Why should we do it? And what does it do, actually? Dale, let's dive back in. You said we've kind of talked about why folks want to have a Convention of the States, that it's one of two ways to amend our United States Constitution. Right. And it's to address three main issues. Again, summarize quickly the issues.
Three main issues that we're looking to do to reel in a runaway federal government. Number one is fiscal restraints. That is some sort of monetary spending limits on what Congress can and cannot do. Right now, they don't have any limits at all, or they don't honor any limits. Number two is term limits, either for the members of Congress, including both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and also other federal officials, which could include judges and justices in the judiciary system. And then number three is just generally to reduce the power and the jurisdiction of the federal government. So, such as when the EPA comes in and says, we're going to regulate your pond in your backyard for some reason that doesn't make any sense to a farmer who needs that pond. I mean, it's just those kinds of things is what we're looking for.
All right, and so we talked about the debt. Let's talk about the second one, where the term limits. Give the folks examples of why folks think a term limit on Congress and other federal folks are necessary.
One of the beauties of the federal government as written in the Constitution is it dispersed power. And this is something Antonin Scalia was the former Chief Justice who died a few years ago.
And it makes them accountable.
It makes them accountable. Yep. When you leave the same person in the same position for decades.
And we have that.
And that's what we have in the judiciary, lifetime appointments in the judiciary. You're concentrating the power into single individuals. And whether they're good folks or not, after a while, that concentration of power is just not good for a country.
And I think that's the issue. We started the show talking about, these guys that founded the country and wrote the Constitution were running away from a dictator, in essence, a king. What's happened over the centuries now is we have 5 out of 4 justices controlling the judiciary. You have a Congress where the leadership of the House and of the Senate are made up by 3, 4, 5 folks, and they have all the power based on the rules in those institutions. And you have one president. So all the power is in these very few folks.
And the judiciary has, in essence, rewritten the Constitution. The actual Constitution could fit in your pocket. It's a little small pamphlet, easy to read. Anybody can read it. But the Constitution they follow is a 3,000-page bound volume with interpretation, such that the Supreme Court quit reading the Constitution. Now they're only reading their own opinions.
And they're the ones who are interpreting it.
Right.
And so it's a never-ending loop.
Right.
So they're not going to constrain their power, just like Congress isn't going to constrain their spending. The judiciary is not going to constrain its power. People always want more.
It just seems to be the nature of governments.
So and of course the president has term limits. Congressmen are run for election.
Right.
And so it's not like an unheard of concept.
Right. The Louisiana legislature, they're all term limited, as well as our governor is term limited. So it's a concept that needs to be discussed. The convention can't pass it alone. But they can propose it as an amendment, and if the states choose to ratify that, then it becomes part of the Constitution.
So let's talk about the third item now, the focus, which is limiting the power of the federal government and kind of rebalancing it where the states and the people have it.
What's happened is over the decades is Congress has given these grants of power to the administrative agencies. I said earlier the EPA, the IRS, but any of those names that you can think of, health and welfare, education. I mean, for example, the Constitution nowhere gives the federal government any authority to regulate education. But now we have this huge Department of Education up in Washington, D.C. that regularly tells our local school boards and states how to run their schools. And we're just we're looking for any creative idea that everybody can agree on,
right,
that will limit the power and the jurisdiction of the federal government in any of those matters other than simply fiscal limits or simply term limits.
Well, it's interesting. We're talking about power being focused in few individuals. In reality, what's happened is Congress has delegated a lot of its power to the president via legislation and or agencies.
And to the administrative agencies, exactly.
And those guys write, quote, rules which are like law in reality.
So whether you like the president or not, our current president or our last president or previous presidents, a lot of the power is now vested in the administrative state, the administrative
bureaucracy.
agencies. The bureaucracy, exactly.
Who are there unappointed, rather not elected, and can be there for decades too.
And their interpretations even become, and you and I do this, we're both lawyers, their interpretations from the administrative standpoint can become law. Because the judges who are then interpreting those administrative rulings defer to those rulings, and that does become the law.
So what specifically item 3 would do is what? Redefine or expressly state what powers they have and don't have, redefine terms that are been used by the judiciary and these agencies to expand the power
Well,
of the
for
federal
example,
government?
the Interstate Commerce Clause has been distorted into the Anything Commerce
Right.
Clause. The word welfare in the Constitution, which is not a grant of power, has become a grant of power. And there are all kinds of things like that. So really, that third segment that we're talking about allows for any creative ideas for people to come up with to say, we're going to reduce the power and the jurisdiction of the federal government.
All right. So let's shift gears. Let's talk about how this in reality takes place. So how does a convention of the states become a reality?
It's a 4-step process to actually have an amendment to the Constitution, and Louisiana has done 2 of the 4. 2 years ago, we passed the resolution calling for the Convention of States. And again, you've got to have 34 states, or two-thirds. It's 3/4 to ratify, 2/3 to get the convention called. We passed that resolution 2 years ago. So we've joined with 11 other states, now 12, to say to Congress, we want to have this convention.
And that's by a majority of the vote in the legislature.
Right. It's strictly a resolution. It's not an act. It's not a law. It doesn't require the governor's signature, regardless of who the governor is. It's simply the House says yes, the Senate says yes, and so Louisiana has passed.
A majority of the House and a majority of the Senate.
Correct. And it actually had to go through the committee process just like any other act or any other resolution.
And again, the executive, in this case the governor, has nothing to do with it, right?
Correct. And it's passed, that resolution passed by very high margins with people from both sides of the aisle. I'm not going to say it's totally bipartisan. There's nothing anymore that's bipartisan, unfortunately. But it passed by very high margins. So step number 2,
which happened this year, right?
Last week.
Okay, great.
Just last week, in the final moments, literally the final hours of the legislative session before it stopped and became a special session, the Commissioner Selection Act was passed. It's House Concurrent Resolution number 4. Passed on Friday afternoon about 6 o'clock. And it basically says...
That's the best thing those guys did.
It was good. It basically says this is how we're going to select the people who are going to go and represent Louisiana. Here's how we're going to give them instructions, and here's how we're going to supervise those people. So that the commissioners or delegates who go to this convention will be selected, instructed, and supervised by the state legislature.
And the makeup, as I understand it, of those delegates is what?
Well, 5 delegates and 3 alternates.
Okay.
Of the 5 delegates, 2 must be non-members of the legislature. That is citizen folks, you or me. They cannot be members of Congress. They cannot be members of the U.S. Senate. They cannot be federal employees or even employees of federal contractors. And they can't be a sitting state elected official, like a governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state.
It's keeping it close to the people.
It's keeping it close to the people.
Excellent. All right. And so we've now passed those first 2 of the 4 steps.
Right.
What is the third step?
The next one will be when the convention is actually called, when 34 states have said we want to do this and Congress says, okay, let's do it. Then the legislature gives specific instructions to the delegate. Well, first they go pick them, but then they give them instructions as to what you can do and what you can't do.
All right, we'll continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Honest. My guest, Dale Clary. We're talking about a convention of the states. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. First of all, I want to thank you for considering our firm for help in handling your legal matter. We know what we're doing. We've been around for a long time. We have over 60 years combined legal experience as lawyers. I've been practicing over 30 years, Sean over 25, and I have paralegals and legal secretaries who've worked for me for over 27 years. We've handled about every kind of case you can handle, and we've been very good at it. The bottom line is, it is our goal to be your protector when necessary, advisor, negotiator, and to successfully conclude the litigation for you in a way that is very favorable. Knowledge is power, and the folks who know what they're doing empower you. They enable you to make the right kind of decisions that best serves you. And that's our number one goal, frankly. Our number one ministry is to serve you.
Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. Glad to have back on the show Dale Clary. We're talking about trying to get a convention of the states. Let's dive back in. So there's 4 things that has to happen at the state level.
Right.
For them to do what they need to join hopefully enough states that a convention of the states is called. Quickly summarize them again.
Yeah, step 1 is to call the resolution. That is to pass the resolution to call for the convention of states.
By majority of the vote in the legislature.
Right,
of that
each house of the legislature, in
Okay.
fact. We did that 2 years ago, in 2016. The second step is to figure out a process for choosing the delegates and how to give them instructions on how to supervise these delegates or commissioners. Louisiana passed that again by a vote of both houses just last week as they finished the legislative session before they went to special session. The next step will be when a convention is actually called, the state will refine which instructions they're going to give to the delegates or the commissioners. And then finally, when there are proposals that come out of this convention of states, will be the actual ratification of those proposed amendments.
So that would be the final step.
That would be the final step.
So one, it sounds like the third step is organizational at the state level. And then the fourth is organizational basically at the convention.
Well, the fourth step is when the amendments come back
ratify.
out of the convention. But once the convention is called, the states run it. Congress can say, here's where we're going to do it, and here's when we're going to do it. But once that's done, the states are the ones who choose who's going, what instructions they're going to have, and how they're going to be supervised.
And so, as I understand it, the Constitution uses the word shall, so Congress can't stop this.
Correct.
The president can't stop this, whoever it is.
Correct.
It's going to take place if you have 34 states.
Right. And it's so foreign to people because we're so used to the federal government stepping in and controlling everything. You know, I'm here from the federal government, I'm here to help. So we're so used to that to know that actually the states have control is something that's waking up a lot of people.
And it's also, let's talk about the process of how this would move forward at the convention of the states. What's going to happen?
Well, it'll run pretty much like a legislative body. They'll have committees and they'll have floor votes. And the committees will look at some proposals and they go out to the floor and then they'll vote. And when they vote, it's one state, one vote. So Louisiana has the same number of votes as California, New York, and Florida. It's not a population-based thing, it's a state-by-state thing. And that's the way conventions of the states have always operated historically.
And it's important to note, like you did in our conversation, that this is the way the Senate works.
Right.
Every state has one vote, same amount of power,
Right.
and the same thing for the Electoral College.
Right. The Electoral College is kind of a blend. The House of Representatives up in Congress is population-based. The Senate is not. It's two
Right.
senators per state, and then those are blended together in the Electoral College. So you have a little bit of both in there so that the big states don't overrun the little states.
And that's the concept when
That's
it's all
exactly-
said and done.
Exactly.
All right, so at the convention of the states, I guess the delegates form committees that they how do we know that the resolutions passed by each of the states is all on the same topics so that it's not this wide open target shoot?
That's controlled in advance. In fact, there have been over 400 applications for this Article 5 convention, we call it. It's Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. But there's never been a call by Congress because they're all over the place. We got some over here for term limits. We got some over here for balanced budget. We got some over here to repeal Citizens United, a case about federal funding of elections. But there have never, ever in the history of the United States been 34 on the same general subjects. And that's what's different about the Convention of States project. It's all going to be on the same 3 subjects that we've talked about a few times.
So the resolutions passed by the 34 or more states, the results in the Convention of States being called, is not identical perhaps, but it's focused on the exact same 3 issues?
Yes. They're almost completely identical in all the states that have passed it so
So this
far.
is coordinated on a nationwide basis.
It's a grassroots but coordinated effort. That's
All right.
correct.
So this is not going to be a free-for-all where our Constitution is going to be changed in every possible way. It's just on those three issues we've discussed.
It's impossible to do that. One, because the call itself limits the topics that can be brought up. Number two, the delegates who go, or the commissioners, will be chosen by the legislature. The legislature will give those people instructions as to what they can and cannot do. And then there will be a joint legislative committee, that's in the resolution we just passed last week, that will supervise those delegates as they go to the convention to make sure they don't go out the limits. And then the final one, the final killer that makes sure this isn't a runaway, is the ratification process. Nothing becomes part of the Constitution unless 38 states say okay.
All right, and so let's say 5 proposed amendments. They're passed by the convention of the state.
Right.
What's the next step?
Then it goes back to the states to ratify it. Now that can be done in either of
One
two
quick
ways.
question though. While it's during the convention of the states, is it a majority vote?
Yes. So if 26 of the 50 states say we want to propose this particular amendment, it becomes a proposed amendment for ratification to the states.
Okay, so majority vote at the convention of states.
One state, one vote.
Now the proposed amendments go to each of the 50 states.
Correct. Congress.
What happens?
Congress gets to choose what's the ratification process. Will either the state and this is in Article 5 in the Constitution, either the state legislatures can ratify, or there can be what they call ratifying conventions, in which the state selects people, or there is a procedure for people to be elected to go to this state convention to decide whether or not to ratify. I think only one of the 27 amendments has been done that way. Usually it's the legislature that does the
Okay,
ratification.
so historically it would be a majority of vote of the state legislature on a proposed amendment that would come out of the convention of the states.
Correct. A majority vote in each house. Again, the House and the Senate each vote separately.
Okay. And then if it's ratified by 38 of our 50 states,
Right.
they agree with one or all of the proposed amendments,
Right.
what happens?
Well, then it becomes part of the Constitution.
Boom, it's
Boom.
done.
It's done. It becomes the 28th, 29th, 30th amendments of the Constitution.
Now, would you anticipate that there would be litigation over all this?
We're lawyers, Lyle. Of course there's going to be I don't know. I hope not. But you know, there are a lot of people who like power centralized in Washington, D.C. It feathers their nest, whatever that may be. So I suspect there will be some, yeah.
And do you anticipate, do you have an idea of what they would try and argue?
It doesn't. You and I have done this long enough. Lawyers don't need good reason to argue sometimes, and so who knows? It could come from anywhere.
So ultimately, it could be decided by the courts again, sounds like.
If the courts have jurisdiction to decide that, and that's yes, it could be. It could be.
All
Certainly.
right. So what do you anticipate as the time? Let's get an update. How many states? I know.
Right.
I'm proud of Louisiana. Back when we did this a year ago, I think there was 9 out of the 50
Right.
states. Where
Now
are
we're
we?
up to 12, and we're still kind of in the middle of the legislative season for most of the states. It's been passed in 12 states. In another 11 states, it has passed one chamber or the other, either the House or the Senate. And excuse me. But there has been this year. It's either been passed, partially passed, or pending legislation in 42 out of the 50 states.
That's wonderful news.
So it's moving. It's moving everywhere. What's really amazing to me is that 3 million people have now gone online and signed the petition for the Convention.
So what do people do?
Go to conventionofstates.com. Click on it, it says sign the petition. You give your name, you can give your address so they know what district you're in, so they can tell your legislators that you have signed the petition.
And then bottom line is educate folks about the process.
You can educate yourself there online. There's so many resources on the website.
Dale,
you can do it quickly.
Fantastic. Look
Thanks
forward
for
to having you back. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines. Dale Clary talking about Convention of the States. We'll see you next time.